Okay, grade 7, haven't made a video for a while. This is our first in a bit. This is a video on chapter 7.1 on finding common denominators in fractions. Okay, so the first thing we have here is we have two fractions. We have 1/3 and 2/5. And the question is, how do we find common denominators for these? And the answer is, we have to find all of the multiples of each number, and we find out which ones they share. So if I was to write all of the multiples of 3, I would write and 24 and 27. I can go on forever if I wanted to, but I'm going to stop there. And the multiples of 5 would be 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and 30, and so on and forth to infinity. Now, the common multiples they share, or the two ones that they share together, they share the numbers 15, and if I was to go one more, I would find they share the number 30. And they would share multiples beyond that as well. But those two they share. Now, of those two common shared multiples, I could use either one of them as common denominator. So in this case, I could use 15 as a common denominator for both 1/3 and 2/5. Okay? Now, why do we find that? Because once we know an equivalent fraction, the next thing we're going to do is create equivalent fractions using the common denominator. So if I go back to that first question for 1/3 and 2/5, I can take 1/3 and say 1/3 is equal to, or is the same amount as a fraction cut into 15 parts. So if I was to say, okay, let's draw this a little bit. Maybe it'll help to see as a drawing. If I take 1/3 of something, there's 1/3, and if I was to cut that into 15 parts, I could actually cut it into 15 parts here. So now instead of 3 parts, I now have 15 parts, and the amount that's shaded is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have 5/15. If I had 1/3 of a chocolate bar, or if I had 5/15 of a chocolate bar, both fractions represent the same amount. They roughly represent 33%. But how can I do that using an algorithm? Well, what I can do is I can figure out what did I multiply 3 by to get 15. In this case, I have 5. And over here, I would multiply the same thing up top, 5. And I create that equivalent fraction to 1/3, that is 5/15. And if I wanted to prove to you that it was the same amount, I could actually change both 1/3 and 5/15 to a decimal. Now 1/3 you should know, because 1/3 is a decimal. We've learned already is 0.3 repeating. And if I go 5 divided by 15, change that fraction to a decimal, I would get the same number. So both 1/3 and 5/15 represent the amount of 0.3 repeating, or roughly 33.3% of a chocolate bar. Okay? And if I do the same thing with that second fraction, which was 2/5, I'm going to use that common denominator that we found, the first common multiple they shared, which was 15. I'm going to multiply both by 3. And I'm going to find out that an equivalent fraction to 2/5 is 6/15. And I can draw that one as well. So here's a chocolate bar. We're going to cut it into 2/5. This represents 2/5. But if I was to cut it right here, I would create a new fraction. Instead of having 5 parts, there are now 15 parts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of which are shaded. So 6/15 and the original 2/3 are the same amount. And again, if I wanted to change them both to decimals, I can take my calculator and go 2 divided by 5, which is decimal 4. Or I can go 6 divided by 15, which also represents decimal 4, or 40% of a chocolate bar.